There's a few things about that scene that I wanted to sort of focus on really to begin with. And I suppose the first one to say is how important it seemed to be in the dialogue between Moriarty and Sherlock Holmes to keep on exploring the idea of being or not being ordinary. You know, they're extraordinary. There's something about that which really kind of matters, which everything pivots on. There's been a lot written about or discussed about the relationship between Sherlock Holmes and Moriarty as a kind of bromance or something like that. But there's clearly sort of, the relationship between them is highly ambivalent. There's an identification there as well as the fact that they are arch enemies. And there's a kind of parallel in their relationship with the relationship between Sherlock Holmes and John Watson, except the thing about Watson that's very different is he is emphatically ordinary. It's one of the reasons why Martin Freeman plays him so well, is he really kind of plays up that sense of his ordinariness, his down-to-earthness in comparison to Benedict Cumberbatch's Sherlock Holmes, which is a much more kind of eccentric and peculiar kind of character, playing up ideas about him being a high-functioning sociopath and all that sort of stuff. And when he says that he's on the side of the angels, but he's not one of them, that he is Moriarty, there is something there again that I think that's worth reflecting on in terms of what's meant by this idea of extraordinary gentleman. The idea of a gentleman is supposed to, one might assume, convey a series of civilised values about somebody being cultivated, polite, of a certain kind of social status and so forth. But this idea of an extraordinary gentleman, it seems a bit of a paradox. Gentleman is the sort of, if you like, the social norm, but the extraordinary gentleman defines himself precisely by his difference. Or, in the case of Mina Harker from Alan Moore's collection of graphic novels, The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, in some cases an extraordinary gentleman can be a woman. So masculinity is quite a sort of complex, ambivalent kind of thing here. And that's, I suppose, the point I wanted to begin with. This idea of extraordinary gentleman, as captured in this novel, series of graphic novels from which I sort of pilfered the title of this module, the idea of extraordinary gentleman is very much grounded in the popular fiction of the late 19th century and early 20th century. So on this front cover illustration, you've got Alan Quatermain there on the left, Edward Hyde, we have Mina Harker from Dracula, Captain Nemo, The Invisible Man, Dorian Gray's in there as well. So a number of the texts that we'll be looking at on this module all sort of gather together in this sort of fantasy world in which all those different worlds of those novels all sort of congeal into one. Is a kind of fantasy that Alan Moore's exploring and using, not just as a kind of playful fantasy, but also as a vehicle for explaining the culture and the cultural history of the late 19th century, and to some extent the ways in which the preoccupations of the late 19th century are still preoccupations we have ourselves. Hence that idea of steampunk as a kind of reinvention of the Victorian. And it's not just steampunk things like Alan Moore's League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. There's a whole neo-Victorian genre of TV detective series. There's the Mr. Witcher thing with Paddy Considine that's on ITV at the moment. There's Ripper Street, if anybody saw that last year. Penny Dreadful, which is on a cable channel, I think. There's a lot of this kind of thing about. And it gives you a very different sense of the Victorians than the one that prevailed for much of the 20th century. In the early 20th century, a guy called Lytton Strachey, who was part of the same social circle as Virginia Woolf, wrote a book called Eminent Victorians. And it was a kind of hatchet job on the previous generation, of his parents' generation. And it's really the sort of book that set in stone that image of the Victorians as kind of sort of stiff-necked, prudish, allergic to sex, covered up, all this sort of thing about covering up the legs of tables for fear of offending people, and all that kind of stuff, was very much the image that the Bloomsbury group, of which Woolf and Strachey were members, defined themselves against. That kind of generation, that flapper generation of the 1920s and so forth, seeing themselves as kind of young and free and kind of morally ambivalent and sexually adventurous and all those kinds of things, defined against the Victorians. But we've got a very different sense of the Victorian here, I think, one that speaks probably more to our period than that sort of stereotype that Lytton Strachey constructed in the 1920s. And it's perhaps for that reason that a lot of the texts that we're looking at on this module, and things like characters like Sherlock Holmes, Dracula, Dorian Gray, seem to be of perennial interest. People haven't got bored of those stories. They're still making them into films, into TV series, adapting them in various kinds of ways, and kind of fitting them for the present, as in the Sherlock Holmes or the Sherlock series, which is obviously set in the present. But the title of this lecture is The Romance Revival, which is perhaps a term which is less familiar to you, but that is, in a sense, what we'll be looking at on this module. The Romance Revival, referring to a kind of resurgence of interest in the romance as a genre from sort of the mid-1880s, carrying on really. Well, it's not exactly gone away. The Sherlock series being one instance of it, but certainly in that period up to the First World War, sort of from the 1880s to the First World War, I guess will be the period that we're going to be focusing upon. So I wanted to try to give some sort of sense of context for the books that we're looking at, and to try to give you an overarching sense of what the Romance Revival is or was, and also a sense of what kinds of ideas and issues and particular features flow through it. So I thought I'd show you some timelines. Now, I'll start off with a very basic one of the idea of a kind of movement from, really, is this sort of the long 19th century, sometimes referred to, the long 19th century being going from the French Revolution to the First World War. The idea of the long 19th century is simply to say, well, the 19th century doesn't really make sense if you sort of take it from, the dates at the beginning and the end of the century numerically. But there is a kind of overarching unity to that period if you extend it a bit beforehand to the French Revolution. And then you take it to the First World War, when there's two sort of cataclysmic events in European culture and politics, really. And the long 19th century is a period in between them that takes you from one to the other. So, starting off with Romanticism, the very long period of the Victorian age, then the fin de siècle, that sort of period at the end of the 19th century, the sort of 1890s in particular, when there's a sort of sense of things starting to, that 19th century world, the great Victorian edifice starting to kind of fall away, and then the catastrophe of World War I. And there is a sense in which these different periods have some distinctness in terms of the art that's produced, for example. So that's a sort of typically romantic painting by Eugène Delacroix. It's got an exotic subject matter. It's executed in rather a loose kind of style. It's dramatic as well. It's not key to this is it's not representing everyday experience. There's something about it which is romantic, which does appeal to the idea of kind of larger realities, a larger scale to life. In contrast to that, although this isn't a Victorian painting, this is a Vermeer, but it does sort of embody the values of realism, the sort of dominant artistic trend within the Victorian period. And this was a painting, and these paintings in general of the Dutch masters were greatly admired by people like George Eliot and other great realist authors. And what they liked about realism was its attention to detail. This doesn't show up terribly well on this slide, but if you look at the painting, and particularly look at the milk pouring out the jug, the kind of illusion of reality, of liquid flowing, is incredibly precise and impressive. But at the same time, the other thing about it is it's a really kind of mundane image in another sense. It's very much about everyday life, humble people. It's not people having sort of fights in desert scenes on camels and things. It's a woman pouring milk in the kitchen. So realism is particularly concerned with the kind of realistic depiction of everyday life. It's ordinary experience, middle class experience, typically. As we get to the late 19th century, that sense of realism starts to tip over into a sort of connected but also distinct thing called naturalism, which is where those ideas of realistic depiction are taken, but instead of being applied to sort of middle-class life, they're applied to more seedy subjects, the idea of kind of showing up the seamy underside of life. So depictions of alcoholics and prostitutes and things like that are sort of very commonplace in the paintings of people like Edward Degas, which is the absinthe drinker, these sort of vacant stares of lost souls and so forth. And at the same time, the late 19th century, you also have a kind of an alternative kind of movement, which is a movement away from realistic depiction into this much more stylised and sort of eroticised pictures of people like Aubrey Beardsley. And you can sort of trace a narrative through this, I suppose, from Romanticism to realism to naturalism to a kind of rejection of realistic representation almost entirely. The thing that's interesting about the Romance Revival is it kind of tends to be interested in images like this instead, which I kind of don't really seem to fit in with that at all. It's Robert Louis Stevenson writes about the way in which his imagination was sort of fired up more than anything else by this sort of childhood cut-out theatres, of which this is an example. And it seems a deliberate rejection of that whole sort of 19th century tradition of fine art, of great writing and so forth, and a turn towards something which is both more juvenile and more popular or populist. And that's pretty typical of the Romance Revival, which, you know, is in that period there. So it coincides to some extent with the fin de siècle, but it's not really the same thing. Although Oscar Wilde is on this module, and we will be reading the Dorian Gray, and it is in many respects a kind of romance, and it's a Gothic romance in some respects, although it's got other aspects to it as well. But the Romance Revival is very much this kind of return to kind of juvenile and populist kind of forms rather than sort of highfalutin ones. Okay, so that's one kind of timeline. There's another one. Romanticism, the great age of revolution, and depicted in heroic terms here are the storming of barricades, storming of the Bastille and so forth. Very much the story of continental Europe rather than in Britain. The story in Britain, and particularly the Victorian, the dominant political tendency of the Victorian period is a movement of reform, democratic reform, extending democratic voting rights to increasingly broader sections of the population, first to middle-class men, then to all men in general, and then sort of projecting past our timeline, really, the extension of votes to women as well. So there is this kind of sense of a progressive democratisation that runs through the 19th century from revolution, which gives rise to the movement for reform, for fear that the alternative would be revolution in Britain. But this didn't come without kind of reactionary backlashes as well. So the movement towards progressive reform and extension of the vote, particularly as that applied to women, became the subject of kind of reactionary representations, depictions of which this is reasonably typical, in which the movement for women's emancipation is cast in the light of a sort of a domination of men. The woman wearing the trousers and the man doing washing. The title of that is The New Woman's Wash Day. And we see that same kind of anxious, reactionary kind of tendency within the fiction of the Romance Revival as well. This is something, it's a passage from the dialogue in Alan Quatermain by Henry Rider Haggard, which we'll be looking at on the module, in which Sir Henry Curtis, who's an English squire, and he's the great hero of the previous novel, has returned back to England and has found that he's actually got rather bored with it after all these adventures of slaughter and shooting elephants and lions and whatnot. He comes back and he says that he's dead tired of doing nothing more except play the squire in a country that is sick of squires. The idea of a country that's sick of squires is a kind of a rather sort of different perspective on the idea of democratisation. You know, in other words, the idea that the landed gentry are sort of entitled to greater social power. That's an idea which is sort of losing traction. And this is one of the things that's reflected in the book in Alan Quatermain. Eventually they leave and sort of end up setting up a kingdom in a remote part of Africa as a way of escaping from democratisation, precisely. He'd become a victim of an almost unaccountable craving, want to have a go at some large game again. And he talks about, the feeling when one has once tasted brandy and water, milk becomes insipid to the palate. The idea of life in a kind of democratised Britain, and particularly in a society in which women are gaining greater social agency and freedom, is associated with a kind of this domestic constraint, the idea of milk becoming insipid to the palate, the idea of sort of infantilisation, being fed milk and so forth, is something which he finds unbearable. So there's, throughout an awful lot of the fiction we'll be looking at, this kind of reactionary kind of tendency. This striking-looking gentleman is John Stuart Mill, one of the great sages of the mid-Victorian period. The populariser of the notion of utilitarianism, he wrote essays in favour of, women's liberation. He wrote essays on the subjection of women and so forth. Very much a proponent of democracy and liberalism. But he also wrote a book on representative government, as it's titled. And on representative government, he made the case for imperialism and for the denial of democratic rights to colonial subjects. And the reason for this, he said, was because the people of the parts of the world that had been colonised by Britain weren't yet ready for democracy. They weren't able to democratically rule themselves as a culture. And therefore, it was the responsibility of an imperial colonising power to bring them to a stage of civilization in which they could exercise their own democratic rights. And so you have these representations in the mid-19th century of imperialism as this sort of benign thing. You've got the British Empire there as a sort of unifying force that goes all the way around the globe, the empire in which the sun never sets because some part of it is always in the sun as the globe rotates. And it's accompanied by images of the people of the world all existing in this kind of benign harmony, brought together by the British Empire as this sort of globalising force for civilization. So this is the kind of notion of liberal imperialism that prevails in the mid-19th century, in the Victorian period, when Mill wrote his book in 1862 on representative government. But things change as we get into the 1880s. The tone of imperialism changes quite dramatically. No longer is it simply about spreading the light of civilization, but it becomes much more about a kind of naked scramble for power and a scramble for territory specifically. The so-called scramble for Africa in the 1880s. This picture here is a cartoon of Cecil Rhodes, after whom an entire African country, Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, was named, straddling the African continent with one foot in Cairo and the other in the Cape, holding a telegraph line and representing the British Empire has a complete line from Cairo to the Cape, and dressed, it should be added as well, in militaristic uniform as well. That militaristic kind of tendency within imperialism becomes much more apparent in the popular representations of empire of the 1880s and 1890s. And although that map doesn't perhaps show it up as well as it might, the representation of empire becomes less about that sort of sense of a kind of a global harmonising unifying force and much more about this overt carving up of parts of the world for different European countries. So the carving up of Africa and the colour coding of this represents which bits are owned by which different European powers. And as this becomes a more and more obvious naked scramble for control of power, so the illusion of the civilising tendency of empire tends to recede. And this illustration from 1897 shows the similar scramble between Britain, Germany, Russia and France and Japan to carve up China in a similar kind of way. No kind of illusions of a kind of benign project here anymore. In terms of masculinities, the romantic kind of archetype of masculinity, I suppose, is Byron. The mid-Victorian tendency will be that of muscular Christianity. This is a picture of Thomas Arnold, the author of Tom Brown's School Days. That emphasis upon sport and manliness and moral decency and so forth, very much the kind of mid-Victorian ideal. And by the end of the century, we've got Oscar Wilde offering in a sense, it's kind of harking back to Byron, but it's a much more overtly feminised kind of masculinity. And then with the Romance Revival, again, we've got something which seems to jar with all of that, which leaks out, which openly enjoys and celebrates the depiction of violence, which enacts all sorts of kind of identifications with an idea of masculinity as something which is kind of much more primitive, explicitly in those terms. And then a suspicion of modernity that we have in the story of Jekyll and Hyde. We've got a figure who represents civilised middle-class respectability, a doctor, a scientist, but this is a figure who also harbours something which is kind of primitive and bestial. And of course, this ties in with ideas about degeneration, Darwinian ideas about evolution, and so forth. And then another timeline, this time of popular print culture. In the early 19th century, a lot of popular romance took the form of things like the Newgate calendar, which was a series of stories about the lives of famous criminals, or penny bloods and penny dreadfuls. Penny bloods, such as this one, String of Pearls, which was the original title for what became Sweeney Todd, the demon barber of Fleet Street. I'm sure these stories are well known to you, don't need me to summarise them. Or W.M. Reynolds' The Mysteries of London, which you should have read for the seminar this week, which feature body snatchers, murderers, all kinds of things like that. It was literature which was written for an adult audience. It was, deliberately salacious, sensationalised and so forth. Pretty basic stuff in many cases. Robert Louis Stevenson picked up some of this subject matter in a story we'll be looking at next week, The Body Snatcher. But this time it was written in a more kind of literary fashion and pitched to a more sort of middle-class audience, I guess you would say, rather than it being 1 pence for the penny dreadfuls, hence the title. This was 6 pence. This is more in the kind of like 6 pence or shilling shocker kind of category, slightly more at market, slightly more literary. But kind of taking something of that sort of popular culture and sort of reclaiming something of it for mainstream literature. There were lots of other examples of this kind of thing. Spring-heeled Jack was an urban legend of London, of this mysterious figure who had eyes that were glowed red and would breathe fire and sort of hammered on your door and would attack you if you opened your door and could leap over walls and so forth. In many respects, if you look at the image of Spring-heeled Jack, it kind of looks like where the idea of Batman comes from, is this sort of figure who's part superhero, part sort of demonic kind of figure. And the other famous Jack of the late 19th century, Jack the Ripper, which also became a source of popular fiction and was turned into sort of, literature for popular consumption. One of the things that happens over the course of the late 19th century, particularly from the 1860s onwards, is that the market for popular literature changes very radically. And I won't go into huge details about that because I'm going to talk about that in another lecture, but one of the big things it does is produces a much enlarged children's market for consumption of popular literature. And it's a market that can't be readily supplied. I mean, there's sort of an exponential increase in the amount of stuff that's being published for children because they can read now, because it's cheaper to print it, basically. And so what happened was that people would simply retread all this old stuff that had been published in the early 19th century, the penny bloods, but market it to children. Giving rise to a huge moral panic about the impact of penny dreadfuls upon the morals and mental development of young boys in particular. This is a story from 1895 of a boy called Robert Coombs who murdered his mother and stabbed her to death in her bed. Stole the housekeeping money and went on a kind of a binge going to the football and the cricket and what have you. And was eventually prosecuted but got off being hanged because they found a pile of popular novels, penny dreadfuls and so forth, in the house, and therefore they took it that his mind had been corrupted by just reading detective fiction and so forth. So it was something that was a huge matter of concern. And one of the reasons why Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes stories took off so much in the first place was because they were explicitly aimed at trying to clean up the market for popular culture. Strand magazine, published by Nunes, which is what most of Sherlock Holmes stories, not this one, The Study in Scarlet, were published in, explicitly aimed to produce popular literature which wasn't so grotesque and sensationalised. And A Study in Scarlet, features some of the details that you would expect of penny dreadfuls. There's kind of blood-soaked scenes and so forth. Only it turns out it's not the blood's not come from a murder. After all, it's something else, and I won't spoil that for you if you've not read it yet. Okay, so just to briefly kind of sum up all of that. There's not just one timeline involved in this. I suppose that's the main point. There are lots of different strands running through the 19th century that sort of converge within the Romance Revival. There's the whole kind of question of the periodisation and aesthetics and where romance sits within that. There's the political history of the period and how the political kind of ideology that seems to be reasonably common to romance, how that runs through. The shift from liberal imperialism, the idea of spreading Enlightenment across the world to this new imperialism, which is much more kind of macho and militaristic and kind of amoral. And there's plenty of that in the stuff we'll be looking at. The idea of sort of shifting, competing masculine styles, and the idea of sort of wholesale shifts and changes within the print culture of the period, particularly popular print culture. These are all things that we're going to be looking at over the course of the module. And if you go to the reading list section in UniLearn and have a look through the weeks, you'll see that I've given each week a theme, whether it's to do with the detective or pirate or boys and toys and so forth, which will engage in one way or another with one or more of these particular themes here. So do sort of cast your eyes forward over that, because this is really, in a sense, the different strands that we're trying to tease out in the module. Now, the Romance Revival. I wanted now just to sort of really give you a better sense of what the Romance Revival is. I've talked, I suppose, about the context really, but what are we actually talking about in terms of the Romance Revival itself? What is romance? So what, when, who, and why? There's 4 questions. In terms of the what, according to George Saintsbury, who's one of the great sort of advocates of romance and the Romance Revival, he was a critic rather than a producer of romance stories himself. But he wrote many things sort of arguing that romance was in some ways better than realism, that it appealed in different kinds of ways and was something which was less, well, it was better, just leave it at that for now. But he describes romance as a story dealing more with adventure and with tragic passions than with analytic character drawing and observation of manners. Somebody once said to me when I told them what I did for a living, he said that the history of English literature was a history of table manners. And the kind of idea that he was sort of thinking about was this sort of idea, the kind of thing that people say, if you don't like Jane Austen, this is the kind of thing people say about Jane Austen. It's all table manners and observation of manners and that kind of thing. It's a sort of another attack on domesticity. It's another attack on domesticity as the province of women writers as well. I think one of the great developments of the Victorian period was the rise of the woman novelist, and particularly in terms of realism with people like Elizabeth Gaskell and so forth, and George Eliot, of course. So this idea of romance has been something which deals more with adventure and tragic passions and with analytic character drawing and observation of manners. Is to some extent gendered in a fairly obvious kind of way, adventure and tragic passions. Interestingly, for a genre which is kind of overtly masculinist, there is a sort of sense here that the thing that's most important in literature and in fiction is tragic passions, this kind of emotion, rather than observation of manners and intellect. So there's a kind of an overturning of what you might expect in terms of stereotypes of sexual difference and gender binaries and things. Robert Louis Stevenson, in A Gossip on Romance, describes the experience of reading romances in a fascinating way. Because he basically talks about reading as though it should be something which is a kind of ecstatic experience. That's the way he talks about it here, it's almost like somebody being in some sort of drug-fueled or orgasmic kind of experience. That reading should be absorbing and voluptuous. We should gloat over a book, be wrapped clean out of ourselves, and rise from the perusal, our mind filled with the busiest kaleidoscopic dance of images. In any case, whatever it is that he sees in fiction that he's aiming for in what he writes, it is something which is directly sensuous, which kind of produces an effect upon the reader, that sort of stirs something in them, which isn't simply an appeal to the intellect or to a kind of moral sensibility, but is something which sort of acts directly on the nervous system, if you like. And I think in the case of Stevenson, one of the interesting things to keep in mind is just how important boyhood is for him. His own boyhood was marked by almost constantly being unwell. He was ill as a child, he had tuberculosis as an adult. He was never able to do anything particularly physically vigorous. And so there's a sort of an enviousness of what he thinks childhood should have been like that we find in his writing. He talks about that bright, troubled period of boyhood, and he talks about the experience of reading, of character and conversation were but obstacles to brush aside. That's in what you're reading. As we dug blithely after a certain sort of incident, like a pig for truffles. So the idea of reading as being like a pig hunting for truffles is again sort of something which goes against the grain of what you might think of as, a notion of reading as something which is a kind of refined or intellectual activity. Here it's kind of animalistic, bestial even. It's kind of driven by a desire kind of that's almost automatic and intuitive. So this is the kind of reading experience that Stevenson's aiming for. Not something to stimulate the intellect, not something to particularly engage the moral faculties, but something which sort of is more visceral than that. Okay, when Stevenson is going to be important for us to think about the Romance Revival, because the book that more than anything else triggered the Romance Revival in the 1880s was Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson, which he wrote, he published originally in 1881 in a sort of magazine format, and then as a book, revised it for a book in 1883. G.K. Chesterton, who wrote a biography of Stevenson in the early 20th century, said of Treasure Island that it was hardly a historical novel, rather it was essentially a historical event. So Chesterton saw Treasure Island as sort of the event that sort of really more than anything else triggered the Romance Revival. And for Chesterton, the reason why was this. He says, a book written for boys generally meant a book written only for errand boys. Now that's loaded with all sorts of class implications, but it's essentially suggesting that it's kind of low status, not particularly engaging you beyond merely sort of plot and incident itself. He says it seemed a strange association of ideas that it should be written carefully. That's a book written for boys. That it should be written carefully as a book for men and even for literary men. It does not seem strange now because Stevenson had done it quite a long time ago. So the thing that Chesterton's identifying here in Stevenson is this sense in which the Romance Revival is, more than anything else, a kind of like rediscovery of children's fiction, of a sort of child's outlook. Okay. Who? There are a number of sort of important people who wrote about the Romance Revival, who kind of theorised romance and said, why romance in this sense of kind of adventure fiction was something which was important and worthwhile. Stevenson himself wrote a number of essays. In fact, although people tend not to read them so much anymore, Stevenson was one of the great essayists of the age. And he wrote quite a lot about fiction and about romance. Andrew Lang, who sort of collated fairy tales, was an anthropologist and collator of fairy tales and publisher, who was a friend of Stevenson's, is another important writer on romance. Henry Rider Haggard, also one of the novelists we'll be looking at, but he also wrote some essays on romance. And then George Saintsbury, who I quoted not long ago, and Edmund Goss also wrote sort of in defence of romance, against those who sought to disparage it as being kind of, trashy, popular, excessively violent, and so forth. And there are a number of subgenres within romance that we'll be looking at some representations of all of these. So, adventure romance, of which Treasure Island is an obvious example. Detective romance, we'll be looking at some Sherlock Holmes stories. Imperial romance with Rider Haggard's King Solomon's Mines and Alan Quatermain. Scientific romance with The Invisible Man by H.G. Wells, and Gothic romance with Richard Marsh's The Beetle, possibly the weirdest and most wonderful book on the module. Almost entirely forgotten for the best part of a century, but fantastic book. And The Picture of Dorian Gray. Okay, why? Why was the revival of romance? Well, that's in a sense what we're going to be exploring over the course of the module, looking at some of the whys, what purpose these novels and short stories served. One theme that will run throughout the module, and is kind of signalled in the title, is the idea of a crisis in masculinity, or a crisis of masculinity. A term which has been much bandied about in relation to the late 19th century, and indeed in the late 20th century. But this idea of masculinity in crisis, of seeking in some way to reinvent masculinity, to reinvent itself, or to be reinvented, or that it's been subjected to challenge and critique in some ways. And then what you have is a sort of production of all sorts of diverse representations of masculinity. Some of them are extremely heroic, some of them are extremely demonic, Sometimes they seem to be both, as in that sort of identification between Sherlock Holmes and Moriarty, or Jekyll and Hyde, where the demonic, the thing that needs to be kind of excised and thrown away, cohabits in the same space or body or something with the kind of like the most heroic version of extraordinary masculinity. There is nothing in the idea of the extraordinary gentleman which necessarily suggests it's for good or for bad, just extraordinary and paradoxical. There's a reaction against realist values. As I said, that realism tends to be associated with middle-class domesticity, whereas a Romance Revival in many respects is about celebrating a kind of upper-class masculinity. There are market factors as well, and there's, I suppose, the one that's probably going to be the most interesting for us is the idea of the Romance Revival as a vehicle for fantasy, because these are kind of constructing extraordinary identities and often exploring strange or impossible worlds. They allow for the possibility of exploring things which are not feasible or possible within everyday life, so they can become all sorts of ideological vehicles for fantasy. In terms of the reaction against realist values, realism, in its sort of association with democratisation and so forth, and a turn from extraordinary experience to the everyday, has a broadly progressive tendency. It tends to be mostly interested in what ordinary people's lives are like and how they might be improved. So it's broadly progressive. Romance is not romanticism. It's not a reaction against that and a desire to return to revolutionary politics or Byronism or something like that. Romance is much more in sense about kind of casting further back than that to the idea of romance as a sort of medieval narrative form, really. Celebration of the doings of knights errant and so forth. It's the knight wandering around vanquishing foes, and it's kind of chivalric ideas almost, but with a kind of twist, with a sort of late 19th century malaise attached to it. But it's not romanticism above all else, because romanticism was all about kind of extreme possibilities, about going up to the top of a mountain and sort of experiencing the sublime and access to the things which are larger than yourself. Whereas for romance revivalists like Rider Haggard, the opposite is true. Rider Haggard it has a very kind of modest sense of what human nature is capable of. He says it's human. I say Rider Haggard. This is actually Alan Quatermain writing in the novel of that name, and he says human nature is like an iron ring. You can go round and round it. You can polish it highly. You can even flatten it a little on one side, whereby you will make it bulge out on the other. But you will never, while the world endures and man is man, increase its total circumference. Human nature is not an infinitely expandable possibility. It's a fixed thing. It's an iron ring for Haggard. And that means that you place limited expectations on what humans are capable of. Humans are not perfectible, and therefore they need order, and they need a hierarchical order of landed gentry, which unsurprisingly it turns out he's a member of. Andrew Lang sort of adds some sort of detail to this, in that it's not just that human nature is like an iron ring, but also the idea that civilized human nature is in some way substantially different from barbaric or savage human nature is something which Lang dismisses, and indeed so does Rider Haggard. He says, "For nothing did nature leave us all savages under our white skins. She has wrought thus that we might have many delights, among others the joy of adventurous living and of reading about adventurous living." Now, I should reiterate that there is a sort of a strong element of imperialism and racism that runs throughout the fiction that we'll be reading, and that's something to keep in mind at all times, because we need to sort of contextualise this in those terms. But there's also quite an at times surprising way in which that manifests itself. Often the identification is not with a celebration of civilization, whatever that is, but with a celebration of barbarism, whatever that's meant to be in terms of the novel. And there is this sort of sense that the Romance Revival is a recovery of barbarism as a more authentic state of human nature. Somewhat in contradiction to that, all that stuff about rejecting civilization and embracing kind of more authentic, simple ways of life, is the fact that a lot of the Romance Revival, or the fiction associated with it, is very much driven by market considerations, and indeed the technology that's available in the late 19th century, for example, to mock-up photographs to include in the frontispiece. This is from The Lost World. This is Professor Challenger in the middle, who's Arthur Conan Doyle wearing a big beard. Or in She by Rider Haggard, a novel that we won't be looking at in this module, but where there's an archaeological discovery that's sort of mocked up and then photographed and included in the frontispiece. So all this sort of stuff, the possibilities that are available with technological reproduction in the late 19th century are all incorporated within this. So another way of looking at the Romance Revival is to see it not as so much as a genre, but as a commercial entity. That the romance is a kind of commodity, something which sold hugely. King Solomon's Mines was, London was covered in advertising slogans describing it as the most amazing book in the world and so forth. And all that kind of hype, publicity, advertising and so forth is all there. And in terms of vehicles for fantasy, well, we'll get into all of this. New gender formations, a new imperialism, evolution and degeneration, cultural anthropology, naturalism and supernaturalism, spiritualism, all the kind of fascination with the occult that occurs in the late 19th century is all in here. And we'll look at it all over the course of the next 2 terms. Now, that's the kind of the introduction to the Romance Revival and to the module. Just a couple of other things I wanted to say before my time is up. First is that the seminars this afternoon and tomorrow we'll be looking at a couple of very short pieces from G.W.M. Reynolds' The Mysteries of London and Robert Louis Stevenson's essay, A Gossip on Romance. If you haven't already read them, then you should have time to read them over lunch because they're not very long. And you can access electronic copies directly from my reading, so you don't even have to go and find them. You can just get on the computer, click on the links, and it'll take you to them. And just one final word about module assessment. If you're taking Extraordinary Gentlemen as a final year module, then the assessment briefs and the assessment criteria and everything that you need to submit your assignments will be in the assessment tab in the Extraordinary Gentlemen UniLearn site. If you're taking Extraordinary Gentlemen as a second year, then it's the assessment details, your assessment briefs, assessment criteria and all that stuff, the Turnitin link, will depend on which module you're taking it for. If you're taking it for literary history, digital humanities or research methods. The assignment briefs, therefore, for this unit that you're taking will be in the assessment link in the UniLearn site for either literary history, digital humanities or research methods, depending on which one you're taking. If you don't know which one you're taking it for, if you've forgotten, then you can check that at the school office and they will tell you, and you'll get sent out email reminders when those things are due.